Notification came through on my phone at 11,047 on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the time because I'd just poured my second cup of coffee and was standing at the kitchen window watching a cardinal work its way through the feeder I'd hung there 31 years ago. It wasn't a call, it was a text from my daughter. Dad, Melissa and I need you to come to the house this weekend. There's something we need to discuss as a family. Please don't bring anyone. I read it twice. Then I set my coffee down on the counter because my hands had gone slightly unsteady and I didn't want to spill anything. My daughter had never texted me that way. Formal, scheduled, the kind of language you use when you rehearse the conversation 3 times in the car on the way home. I'd known her for 34 years, watched her learn to ride a bike in this same driveway, helped her move into 3 different apartments. She didn't talk to me like I was a meeting on a calendar. I typed back one word, okay. Then I stood at the window for a long time, watching the cardinal eat. My wife had passed 2 years prior. 41 years of marriage, and then a Tuesday afternoon in October, when everything that had held the shape of my life simply stopped. I won't go into the particulars. Some things belong only to the particulars. Some things belong only to the people who lived them. What I will say is that the grief didn't look the way I expected. It wasn't loud. It was more like a shift in air pressure, a permanent slight heaviness in the chest. The kind you stop noticing until a quiet moment makes it unavoidable again. After she passed, I'd done what I was supposed to do. Sold the bigger house, moved into a smaller one on the same street, a 2-bedroom with a good furnace and a yard I could manage. I'd kept busy. Volunteered twice a week at the food bank 2 towns over. Started walking every morning. Made dinner from scratch most nights because it gave the day a shape. My daughter had married young, which I didn't say much about at the time, and her husband had done well enough in commercial real estate that by their early 30s, they were living in a house larger than they needed. He was the kind of man who wore his watch on the outside of his cuff and talked about investment strategies before anyone had finished their appetizers. I hadn't disliked him. I'd learned to receive him the way you receive weather. You don't debate it, you just dress accordingly. I drove over that Saturday. It was late February, the kind of cold that makes trees look like they're bracing for something. My daughter met me at the door, and her smile had the careful quality of a woman who has been practicing it since Thursday. Her husband appeared from the kitchen holding a glass of sparkling water. He offered me coffee. I accepted. We sat in their living room, which always felt to me like a room designed for looking at rather than living in. My daughter spoke first. She'd been working up to it all morning, I could tell. The way she sat forward, the way she kept glancing at her husband, who had arranged himself in the armchair across from me with the relaxed posture of a man who believed this was going according to plan. She said they'd been talking about the future, about my future specifically. She said they were worried that I was alone in that house, that 2 bedrooms was more than I needed, that the neighborhood had changed, that the drive to the food bank was longer than it should be for someone my age. I was 63. I let her finish. Then she said that they'd spoken with an attorney, that they'd looked into my financial situation, my savings, my pension, the house, and that they felt it would make the most sense for me to liquidate the property, move into an assisted living community 40 minutes north, and allow them to manage my finances going forward. She said the word manage the way people say it when they mean control. Her husband nodded at intervals, the way a man nods when he's already decided what's going to happen. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, which was something I usually found comforting. That morning it made the thing she was saying feel lonelier than she probably intended. I asked one question. Has something happened that I don't know about? She said no. She said this was just planning, being responsible, thinking ahead. I said I'd think about it. I drove home the long way, went past the food bank, past the elementary school where I'd coached youth soccer for 9 years, past the church where my wife and I had been married on a Saturday in June. I didn't take the highway. I needed the time. By the time I got home, I already knew what the conversation had really been about. It hadn't been about my health. It hadn't been about my safety. The house I'd moved into after my wife passed had been appraised at 4 times what we'd paid for it decades ago. The neighborhood had changed all right. It had become desirable. And my daughter had lived long enough beside a man who understood real estate to know what that meant. I made dinner, baked chicken, some rice, a salad. Art at the kitchen table with the radio on, the way I'd done most nights. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person I should have called about something like this years earlier, a man I'd known since we were in the army together, who'd since become one of the better estate attorneys in the county. We hadn't talked in 8 months, but he answered on the third ring and sounded exactly like himself. I told him what my daughter had told me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't agree to anything, and don't move." I told him I hadn't planned to. He said he'd make some calls Monday morning. That night, I looked up the assisted living facility my daughter had mentioned. It was clean from the photos. Cheerful in the way of places that know they need to look cheerful. A one-bedroom unit ran just under $4,000 a month. My pension covered slightly more than half of that. The gap would have come from selling the house. The proceeds, presumably, would have gone somewhere. I thought about the attorney my daughter had mentioned. I wondered whose attorney he was, exactly. Monday came. I went to the food bank, sorted boxes for 3 hours, drove home. My phone showed 4 missed calls from my daughter and a text that said, "Dad, please call me. We just want what's best." I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I had decided to let my attorney's voice be the first one in this conversation, and I wanted to keep it that way. He called me Monday afternoon. He'd done some checking. The attorney my daughter and her husband had consulted had prepared something they were apparently calling a family financial management agreement, a document that, if signed, would grant them joint authority over my accounts and primary decision-making regarding my property. It had been drafted by a firm that did this kind of work regularly, which was not a comforting thing to learn. He told me that I had options, that nothing laid repaired was enforceable without my signature, that my capacity was not in question and couldn't be, because there was nothing to question. He said the word predatory once, and then he said it may not feel that way to them, and I appreciated both statements equally. I asked him what he thought I should do. He said, "Stay calm, stay put, and let me write a letter." I said, "Write the letter." My daughter called again that evening. I answered this time. She sounded surprised, then relieved, and then gradually careful again. She asked if I'd thought more about their proposal. I said I had. I told her I'd spoken with my own attorney and that I had some questions about the document her husband's attorney had drafted. I said I wasn't opposed to having a conversation, but that I'd need to have it on different terms. There was a pause on her end that lasted just long enough to tell me something. Her husband got on the line. He said the document was just a formality, a protection, that it was standard in situations like mine. He said situations like mine, the way people say it when they want you to feel like your age is a condition that requires management. I said I understood. I said my attorney would be reaching out to theirs. Another pause. He said, "You got an attorney involved." I said I had one involved the moment I heard the word manage. The call ended shortly after that, not badly, but with the particular quiet of people who have realized a plan requires revision. My attorney's letter went out Wednesday. It was 3 paragraphs. It clarified my legal standing, my full cognitive and legal capacity, my ownership of the property free of any encumbrance, and my lack of interest in executing any document granting third-party authority over my finances or housing decisions. It also noted that any further attempts to pressure, persuade, or schedule meetings for that purpose without my attorney present would be documented accordingly. The response came from their attorney 5 days later. The tone had changed considerably, measured, courteous. The word misunderstanding appeared twice. My daughter came to the house on a Thursday evening alone. No husband. She knocked instead of using the key I'd given her, which told me something. I let her in, made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table. She looked tired, not angry tired, the other kind. She said she didn't realize how it had come across. She said she was scared that after her mother died, she'd become scared in a way she hadn't known how to name, and that her husband had offered a plan, and the plan had felt like a solution to something she couldn't solve herself. I listened without interrupting. I told her I understood fear. I told her I'd been living with a version of it for 2 years. I told her that her mother would have asked questions too, and that I thought she already knew that. She cried a little, not dramatically, the kind of crying that's really just relief finding an exit. I told her that I wasn't going anywhere, that the house was mine, and that it would stay mine until I decided otherwise, on my own terms, for my own reasons, that if she wanted to be part of my life, genuinely part of it, not managing it from the outside. I wanted that too. She nodded. She held her tea with both hands the way she had when she was small. I asked her to tell her husband to have his attorney stop sending correspondence to mine, that if there was something to discuss, we'd discuss it as a family without documents. She said she would. She left around 9. I walked her to the door, watched her headlights back out of the driveway, and stood on the porch longer than necessary because the cold felt honest. In the weeks that followed, things shifted. Not overnight, not with any grand announcement. Her husband called once, short and businesslike, and said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I said there weren't, which was mostly true. Hard feelings are a luxury. I'd learned to prefer clarity. I did make one change. I sat down with my own attorney and got my estate documents in order, properly, deliberately, in language that left nothing to interpretation. I named a successor trustee who was neither my daughter nor her husband. I documented my wishes with the kind of specificity that makes disagreement difficult. I'd been putting it off since my wife passed, and the uncomfortable conversation with my daughter had done something useful. It had made the procrastination feel expensive. The food bank kept me on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I added a Saturday in March. The work is physical enough to be satisfying and quiet enough to think, and the people there don't need anything from me except a set of hands and a willingness to show up. My daughter and I have dinner most Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but most. She comes alone sometimes with the kids. Her husband comes occasionally, and we talk about sports and weather, and once, unexpectedly, about what it was like for me when my own father got old and I didn't know what to do. He listened more carefully than I expected. People surprise you when the pressure's off. I still stand at the kitchen window in the mornings. The cardinal comes back, or one that looks like it, which amounts to the same thing. I drink my coffee. I watch the yard. I don't feel like someone who won something. Winning implies the thing was a game, and it wasn't. It was just a moment when someone I loved looked at me and saw a problem to be solved, instead of a person to be trusted. And I had to decide how to respond to that without losing either of us in the process. The house is still mine. I'm not going anywhere I don't choose to go. And on Sunday mornings, when my daughter pulls into the driveway and my grandchildren come through the door already talking, I think about the phone call I made on that February night, the one where I asked for process instead of permission, for counsel instead of comfort, and I understand that it was the right call, not because of what I kept, because of what I didn't have to become in order to keep it. The cardinal came back the morning after my daughter left, or one that looked enough like it to matter. I stood at the window with my coffee going cold in my hand and thought about how little noise the whole thing had made in the end. No courtroom, no shouted accusations, no moment that would make a good scene in a movie. Just a kitchen table, 2 cups of tea, and a woman who still had her mother's eyes finding her way back to something honest. I've had time to sit with what happened, and what I keep returning to isn't the documents or the attorneys or the legal language that made the plan fall apart. What I keep returning to is the choice I made in those first few hours. Not to panic, not to accuse, not to make it a war. That choice didn't come from nowhere. It came from 63 years of watching what happens when people let fear make decisions on their behalf. My daughter let fear do that. She handed it the wheel and trusted her husband's certainty to fill in the rest. That's not a character flaw. That's just what grief does to people who haven't figured out how to carry it yet. But I also know this. The moment I picked up the phone and called someone I trusted, someone with no stake in the outcome except doing the thing correctly, was the moment the situation stopped being something that was happening to me and became something I was navigating. There's a difference, a significant one. Wisdom isn't knowing all the answers ahead of time. It's knowing which call to make when you don't. What I didn't do was fold. That matters too. I was 63 years old, recently widowed, living alone, and my own daughter had handed me a document designed to take my home. There were 100 ways I could have told myself that resistance was too hard, that it would damage the relationship permanently, that maybe they knew something I didn't, that maybe it was time. I didn't tell myself any of those things because none of them were true, and I've lived long enough to know the difference between a hard truth and a comfortable surrender dressed up to look like one, the integrity in it. And I do think there was integrity in it, wasn't in winning. It was in refusing to become someone smaller than I was in order to avoid a difficult conversation. My wife used to say that the people who love you should be able to handle the full-sized version of you. She was right about most things, and she was right about that. My daughter is finding her way back. So is her husband slowly, in the way of men who need to believe they're reasonable once the evidence cools down. I'm not keeping score. Keeping score is for people who are still trying to win something. I'm just trying to stay pleasant, stay clear, and make sure the house I leave behind, whatever form that eventually takes, reflects choices I actually made, rather than ones that were made for me. The cardinal doesn't know any of this. He just comes for the seeds. I think about that sometimes. How the ordinary things keep showing up regardless. How the feeder still needs filling. How Tuesday mornings at the food bank still come around. How Sunday dinners are starting to feel like Sunday dinners again, which is something I wasn't sure would happen. It happens. Things settle. Not all the way, and not all at once, but enough.